Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the first Harvard Open Campus Initiative event of the year. My name is Robert Capodilupo, and I'm a board member for the Harvard Open Campus Initiative. Last month, a federal court began to hear arguments for a case filed against Harvard challenging its affirmative action policies. Students for Fair Admissions, the organization bringing forth the suit, has argued that Harvard's race-conscious admissions process have unfairly discriminated against Asian students. Tonight, we are excited to welcome two very special guests to openly discuss this issue. Heather McDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, and a New York Times best-selling author. Her most recent book is entitled The Diversity Delusion: How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. She holds degrees from Yale University, University of Cambridge, and the Stanford Law School. Gregory Davis is a doctoral candidate in African American Studies with a concentration in psychology at Harvard University. He holds a bachelor's in psychology from Morehouse College, and he completed a joint JD/MA at UCLA in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Heather and Gregory.
It's best to stay here because that's actually not in the shot.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Capodilupo, and thank you to the Open Society Initiative. I'm honored to be here, and I thank everybody for coming out in what is, I'm sure, leading up to finals frenzy. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to us, and I appreciate Mr. Davis as well being willing to talk to me about this. I'm an atheist. I can predict with great certainty that between me and just about any evangelical Christian, there will be significant diversity in how we understand the world, with the Christian seeing a loving personal God behind events both good and bad, and me seeing a combination of human striving and random, often cruel fate. I'm a conservative in many things. I can also predict with great certainty that between me and just about any progressive, there will be significant diversity in how we understand the world, with the progressive seeing structural forces playing out and with a determining role in socioeconomic disparities, and with me seeing a larger role for individual behavioral choices. If Harvard wanted reliable proxies for a diversity of worldviews, it could use religious faith and political outlook in its admissions and hiring processes, among other voluntary attributes of the self. It does not. When Harvard talks about diversity, like every other selective college today, it is talking overwhelmingly about one thing: race. This focus presupposes that race is a valid proxy for experiences, viewpoints, and even character. It is not. I know conservative whites and liberal blacks, liberal whites and conservative blacks. The chief diversity officer at Apple made this same point in October 2017. Quote, "There can be 12 white, blue-eyed, blonde men in a room, and they're going to be diverse because they're going to bring a different life experience and life perspective to the conversation," Denise Young-Smith said at a conference in Bogota, Colombia. Apple promptly fired Smith for violating diversity dogma, and she issued a groveling apology, telling the Apple staff that her remarks were not, quote, "representative of how I think about diversity or how Apple sees it." Smith was right the first time around. Race or gender are not the most important aspects of human beings. They are not even particularly interesting. Being female is not an accomplishment. To treat race as a predictor of a worldview is to essentialize it, even though we are constantly told that race is a social construct. So diversity rhetoric is just a fig leaf covering up the effort to engineer a critical mass of so-called underrepresented minorities, i.e. blacks and Hispanics, by admitting and excluding students on the basis of race. Engineering that critical mass entails setting very different thresholds for different racial groups to even be considered for admission. And Asians are the most handicapped by these racial quotas at Harvard and every other selective college. Asians are admitted at the lowest rate of any racial or ethnic group at Harvard, despite having the highest academic qualifications. Test scores and GPAs that would give an Asian an only 25% chance of admission at Harvard would be a virtual admissions guarantee, 95%, for a black student. The average combined SAT of Asians from 2010 to 2015 at Harvard was 218 points higher than for blacks. Nationally, Asian students applying to highly selective private colleges faced odds 3 times as high as similar whites, 6 times as high as similar Hispanics, and 16 times higher than similar African Americans. Let me stress here that I'm talking about averages, not about individual students who may fall anywhere on the test score continuum. These racial preferences are not about creating socioeconomic diversity. Harvard's racial preferences catapult richer black students ahead of poorer but more academically prepared white and Asian students. And Harvard admits more than twice as many non-disadvantaged blacks as disadvantaged blacks, and confers no admissions advantage on disadvantaged blacks compared to advantaged blacks. Race is also not a minimal factor in the admissions black box. Harvard claims that if it were not allowed to take race into account, the percentage of blacks at Harvard would be 0.2% compared to the current 14%. The Asian share of the student body would be at least 43% by Harvard's own estimate, compared to 18% if Harvard did not artificially limit the number of Asians it admits. In sum, being black quadruples your chances of admission to Harvard, while being Asian drastically reduces it. Now I'm going to discuss just 3 problems as I see it with racial preferences. The most obvious is that they're unfair to Asians and to a lesser extent to whites. Asians are discriminated against for their academic hard work and success, required to present academic qualifications much higher than any other racial group to even be considered for admission simply because of their ethnicity. Colleges like Harvard fight tooth and nail against disclosure of their admissions data because they know that the public will see this Asian handicap as unfair. The second problem is that preferences catapult their alleged beneficiaries into academic environments for which they are not academically competitive. Let's take the analysis out of the race arena. Let's say MIT wanted to increase its proportion of females, and so it admitted me with math SATs of 650 on the 800-point scale, whereas my peers were averaging on the about 800 on their math SATs. What would happen in my first year at MIT? The teaching in freshman calculus would be pitched to the average preparedness of my peers and not to me, and I would struggle to keep up. I may decide that I was not cut out for a career in STEM and switch majors or drop out entirely. If instead I had gone to a school for which I was academically prepared, a Boston University, say, a perfectly respectable institution, instead of MIT, and where the teaching was pitched to my level of skills, I would have a much greater chance of graduating with a STEM degree and pursuing a career in science. This disjuncture between a preference beneficiary's academic preparedness and that of his peers is called the mismatch effect. And it occurs with racial preferences as well, which is another reason why colleges and professional schools have also fiercely resisted releasing data on academic outcomes of preference beneficiaries. It is also the case, however, that, and let me address legacy preferences. I'd love to eliminate them entirely. But it's also the case that they're much smaller than racial preferences and create a smaller mismatch effect. Now, the mismatch effect has been best documented in law schools. In a national sample comprising tens of thousands of law students, after the first year of law school, 51% of black law students were in the bottom 10th of their class, compared to 5% of white law students. 2/3 of black students were in the bottom 5th of their class. Black law students were 2 times as likely to drop out as white law students. And blacks are 6 times as likely to fail the bar after multiple attempts. So we end up, ironically, having fewer black lawyers than we would have had in the absence of racial preferences. The same mismatch effect has been documented at Duke. A larger percentage of black male freshmen entered Duke intending to major in a STEM field. But by the time of graduation, most have changed majors into the humanities or social sciences, leaving STEM graduates overwhelmingly dominated by whites and Asians. Why is that? Because Duke admits black students with one standard deviation of academic qualifications below that of their white and Asian peers. There's no shame in graduating with a humanities or soft social science major, of course, but if our goal is increasing the number of underrepresented minorities with STEM degrees, racial preferences work against that goal. Let me be perfectly clear. No opponent of racial preferences is saying that underrepresented minorities should not go to college or professional school. What opponents such as myself are saying is that every student should go to a school for which he is prepared and not put at a handicap by having to compete against better prepared peers. The third problem with racial preferences is that they paper over the reason why preferences are believed to be necessary in the first place, the academic skills gap. The average black 12th grader reads at the level of the average white 8th grader. On the 2018 ACT test, 69% of Asians were prepared for college math, nearly half of whites were, and 13% of blacks were. Again, we're talking averages. Any given student may fall at the far end of the distribution tail. Closing that achievement gap should be the focus of education. If it were closed, the entire discourse of diversity would disappear entirely. In conclusion, my solution would be to admit students on objective, meritocratic grounds of academic achievement alone, so that all students are prepared in college to compete and succeed. Colleges are going to do everything they can to hold on to the preference regime, however, no matter how counterproductive it has been. So the second best solution would be complete transparency. Colleges should publish, since they insist on classifying students by race, they should publish the average academic qualifications of those racial groups upon entry, and most importantly, publish the outcomes. So students themselves can decide where they have the best chance of succeeding and going on to pursue the major of their choice. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing a response from Mr. Davis.
Well, thank you, Heather. I really appreciate the Open Campus Initiative for inviting me today and giving me the opportunity to talk. Before we got started, I got an opportunity to talk to one of the audience members here today. Her name is Tolu. She is from Yorubaland or Nigeria, and we got an opportunity to talk about our mutual experiences. She's an international student. I've never set foot on the continent of Africa. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. I attended Detroit Public Schools. And in many ways, I fit the bill of what Ms. McDonald called the disadvantaged African American student. I come from a single parent household. I came from a background that was lower middle class. And I attended public schools my entire life. And Tolu, for instance, as an example, may not classify or may not exist in that same realm. However, it's extraordinarily important that both of us are here today. In our short conversation, we got to learn a lot about each other and a lot about our mutual experiences here at Harvard. There were a couple things about this entire debate that I think are really important to kind of set up as ground rules, ground understandings that really help shape where this discussion is going to go. Both things that people don't realize about admissions in higher education and things that people misconstrue or misunderstand about admissions in higher education. The first thing that has to be understood, and this makes the kind of goals of admissions readily apparent to anyone who does understand this, is that admissions is not about assessing individual merit. It's not at all about that. It is about building a class. And building a class is a lot like building an investment portfolio. You want to invest in resources that are going to give you a good return on your investment. And one essential aspect of this type of portfolio building and building a class of incoming students is diversification. So any of us who understand that know that it doesn't make any sense to put all of our resources into this stocks in the same market or stocks from the same kind of company. We risk greatly losing out when we make such investments, because if something goes wrong with that market, if something goes wrong in that area, we are going to lose out. Also, we use diversification as a means to not only kind of shore ourselves up, but to make sure that we have a hand in a little bit of everything. If the market's going up, we've bought the right kind of stocks to match that. The market's going down, we shorted the right stocks. Admissions works very similarly. The goal is to create a class of people who will not only bring in value that as overweighs the investment the college makes in you, but also to have different types of impact to explain their value. And this type of impact and this type of value can be measured in myriad ways. It can include things like alumni donations in the future. It can include things like being elected to state office or coming to represent your constituency in another way. It can represent things such as being, the first African American to receive a PhD at Harvard, like Dr. William Edward Bogart Du Bois. And this is a really important kind of thing to know about the use of race in higher education, that it's not meant to kind of be a form of reparations or a form of kind of charity. It is meant to kind of shore up the investment that colleges make in students and in their future progeny. We're rapidly entering a world that it will be majority non-white, and Harvard would be extraordinarily remiss to have legions of alumni, living alumni, who are representing a smaller and smaller proportion of the population. That's kind of the central aspect of what admissions is. And once we understand that, we can understand the benefits of diversity, even diversity on the basis of race. Now, I will absolutely admit that knowing someone's race tells you little, if anything, about them. But denying someone the ability to discuss their race also hides and obfuscates a big amount of information. When I applied to law school at UCLA in 2010, I applied to a law school that was in a Prop 209 state, California. In California, there's no ability to use race or gender in admissions. And I had to make a case to them that I was of value to them. I was a stock worth investing in. In order to do that, it was essential for me to talk about my accomplishments, the groups I helped to run, the college I went to, the grades I got. I attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. That's a historically black college and university. Originally from Detroit, Michigan, I went to a high school that was 98% black. I was a member of various black student organizations, both in college and in law school. I was on the board of the Black Law Students Association. And when it was time for me to fill out my personal statement, talk about my journey, there was no way that I could actually discuss who I was or what made me a worthy investment without discussing my race. For many people, that's not what they kind of, build their lives around. They may build a life around their interest in politics or their interest in sports or athletics. But for me, and for many people of color in the United States, the thing that we are invested in, the thing that makes us special, the thing that we bring value to the colleges and universities for are our investments in communities of color and our investments for communities of color. Another aspect I think Ms. McDonald misquoted herself on is this idea that these colleges and universities themselves are the ones obsessed with race. Colleges and universities are required by law to keep track of the race and gender of their applicants for the express purpose of obeying the federal laws. And in states like California, Michigan, my home state, as well as Colorado, states that have, and Texas, and states that have gotten rid of affirmative action law, they ask the same questions and keep the same records. It's important to understand that. And to reply to just one other point that Ms. McDowell made, this idea that Blacks and Hispanics are at supreme academic disadvantage when it comes to applying for college, she seems to be making the argument, and I'm sure she'll get to correct me if I'm wrong about the summary. She seems to be making the argument that the systematic disadvantage that follows Black and Hispanic students all through K through 12 education somehow justifies another systematic disadvantage in the college admission system. That seems backward to me, as there has to be some mechanism to overturn or to uproot the kind of systemic issues that affect students of color in education, that made sure that my educational background in Detroit was extraordinarily subpar to students who went to Cranbrook, the elite boarding school just 40 minutes away in Michigan. And by saying that, oh, college is not the place to rectify or even to attempt to rectify any kind of past systemic inequality, that it has to happen earlier, puts an imposition not just on the government to completely change the entire public education system to make it more equal, which is a thing they should do, but it also positions colleges as having no choice or no ability in the matter. I think we'll get a chance to talk about this in a little bit, but one thing that I think is extraordinarily important about affirmative action is the difference between the morality of affirmative action and the law of affirmative action. One of the things we're here to debate is the kind of moral or ethical aspects of how admissions works, but an important thing to know is how the law treats affirmative action. One thing that the law makes a fine distinction on is what is or is not racial discrimination. Racial discrimination under the law, at least as the Constitution sees it, is explicit and substantive discrimination of a group based by a decision maker of a public institution. And so that does not include kind of statistical disadvantages of one group or another. That does not include patterns of admissions criteria over years and years and years. It does not include implicit bias. When I think about the current lawsuit going on with Students for Fair Admissions, I think of an admission system that is probably replete with implicit bias against Asian American students, and frankly, students of color generally. I think of an academic admission system that sees Asian Americans as being robotic, as being not able to lead, as being all one and the same, and completely interchangeable. I have little doubt that something like that is what's going on in these admissions offices to have the type of disparate impact that Asian American students have had. This also goes to prototypicality bias. The more you're differentiated from the prototype of what we want in college admissions or any other system, the more you are kind of seen as not the prototype, and the more of a gamble you're seen to be in the admissions process. It's one of the reasons why the Asian population here at Harvard is predominantly Korean, Chinese, and Japanese, and you don't see the representation of Hmong, Laotian, Southeast Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Polynesian students here. It's one of the reasons why you don't see that anywhere. But the law of affirmative action and the law of racial discrimination does not cover implicit bias. It does not cover, years of mistakes. As Chief Justice John Roberts said, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discrimination on the basis of race. What's going on at Harvard is not, as the Constitution sees it, discrimination on the basis of race. It is a sad, sad fact that institutions around this country can get away with non-explicit discrimination every day. But the solution to that issue is not to dismantle one of the only systems that has been developed to counteract it. Thanks.
All right, thank you both. We'll try now to go through a series of questions and flesh out some of the points you made. I want to start with you, Heather. So you brought up mismatch theory, and it's one of the sort of key questions as to whether or not affirmative action is a good empirical policy, sort of leaving aside the moral questions for a bit. And if you take Gregory's analogy of looking at admissions as building a stock portfolio, or trying to point at some emergent phenomenon called a class, which sort of gets better as you basically make it more colorful or more diverse. I wonder if you could say a bit about whether that offsets some of the negative effects potentially seen in mismatch theory, or if you don't find that as a compelling analogy.
I'm not totally persuaded by Mr. Davis's analogy, because the more data you have, it is pretty predictable. There is a very strong correlation between the level of academic preparedness of students and their subsequent performance. So the diversification, I think there's a lot more uncertainty within ranges of stocks than what we've seen in studying mismatch. Every single school where this has been looked at has found that students admitted with large gaps in their academic preferences do not overcome. That was always the hope, that they would overcome, whether it's through remedial education or effort, the huge gap in entrance qualifications. It doesn't happen. Again, the law school data, which is tens of thousands of data points, the students admitted with lower qualifications end up at the bottom of their class, and that is ubiquitous at every law school, and it happens in law firms as well. But the point is that you'd have as much diversity. The only place, if we got rid of preferences, schools would still be diverse. It's just that the black students wouldn't be catapulted one level or two levels up. They would be matched. What I find incredible about this debate is the snobbery on the part of the elite institutions, that the implication is, unless you go to Harvard, your career is over. When California, as Mr. Davis said, tried to ban racial preferences in government, including the University of California system, the chancellor at Berkeley said, well, where are we going to get the leaders of the future if they can't go to Berkeley via racial preferences? And my view is, what is the chancellor of UC Riverside or UC Santa Cruz that is less competitive, thinking that it's impossible to become a leader if you go to UC Riverside? If that's the case, if it's such a crippling effect, why don't we close down all third-tier schools if it is so unfair to burden students with that disadvantage? So you would have as much diversity.
We're going to actually try and keep these to 30 or 60 seconds.
Sorry.
Do you want to respond briefly?
No,
I have a question for you.
I would love to. So the mismatch theory is predominantly pushed by Professor Richard Sander, who is a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. I got the distinct pleasure of getting to talk to Richard about his mismatch theory on several points. I am a quantitative social scientist, and he gave a presentation to us on his data. And despite Ms. McDonald's claims that these kinds of outcomes are definitive or have a real impact, the truth is Mr. Sanders' data is decades old, faulty, makes many assumptions that are irrelevant to the outcomes that are of interest. the important thing to kind of note is where you go to school is much more predictive of future success than what you did when you were in school. The people who are in the bottom 10% here at Harvard will statistically have standards of deviations better success in the workplace and in their lives than people who are in the top 10% at schools like UC Santa Cruz, for example. I'll stop
I actually
there.
have a brief follow-up because
Yeah.
I think it's important to get into the social science a bit on this mismatch question. I did some of my own research, and it seems like it's actually not particularly clear-cut. Sanders is certainly well known. It's not the case that the only studies indicating that there's some effect to mismatch are old or use bad data. It's also not the case that all of the studies indicate there's an effect. A recent study looked at sort of very aggressive quota systems in India and found almost no mismatch effect. Another study was sort of a meta-analysis in the United States and found that severe reshuffling racially did have mismatch effects. So I think we can sort of leave it there and move on to this question of the skills gap, which you brought up as sort of the primary motivation behind why affirmative action exists. That's actually different than what the Supreme Court said is the reason you might be able to have affirmative action, which would be the diversity in a classroom. It's often the case that the public views the justification for affirmative action as different than legally the justification, what the courts see as justified. So are you comfortable with that difference? Do you think there's, sorry.
Well, I mean, we wouldn't be having the diversity discussion if there wasn't the skills gap. Again, it is the skills gap that has generated the racial preferences, whatever they're in the name of. It started out as compensatory, and then the Supreme Court decided that didn't really wash constitutionally and came up with diversity. So you can have both. I mean, it's true, the justification is diversity. Again, I'm just opposed to the idea that we are going to stereotype people on the basis of race, and I do think that the mismatch effect is, for me, the most powerful argument against it.
Okay, and a sort of a brief follow-up there on the value of diversity. So certainly it seems like, Heather, you're making a distinction between racial diversity or some sort of diversity of appearance versus an intellectual diversity or diversity of worldviews, as you put it. Do you think there's an inherent value in even a diversity of worldviews? What's the inherent sort of moral worth or importance of diversity in the first place?
I don't think it's something we should even think about. I think if a school was 60% Asian, that would be a diverse school. The idea that students can be categorized based on their ethnicity or race is ludicrous. I think individuals are inherently diverse. So I would, and especially if we are worried about implicit bias, why we would want to grant so much open-ended discretion to college admissions officers to engage in their, highly self-righteous, self-regarding magic of creating this diverse portfolio. I would go on the most objective criteria available to us and take the discretion out of it. If we worried about implicit bias.
Well, it's really interesting to talk about what we would consider to be objective criteria. We can talk about things like the SAT or other kind of standardized admissions tests. But one of the funny things about those is that they are not very predictive of student success. The LSAT, for example, only predicts about 10% of the variance in law students' grades in their first year. It's not at all predictive of their grades over the entire time they're in law school. It's not predictive of whether they'll pass the bar. It's not predictive of what type of job they'll get or how much money they'll make over the lifetime. The things that do predict all of those things are what law school you go to. I agree that the kind of project of college admissions as a form of social engineering is troubling, to say the least. But the problem isn't about race, and the solution isn't about race either. I grew up in Michigan again, go blue, and Michigan is one of the most segregated states in the country. All the black people live in the Detroit metropolitan area. All the white people live outside of Detroit. There are people in the state of Michigan right now who have never seen a black person in real life. And if they can come to a place like Harvard or go to a place like college and not see a black person there either, what does that really mean? I get the impression, Heather, that one of the things that you're saying is that black and brown people aren't a good investment. They're not going to pay back in dividends, and I don't believe that to be the case. I believe that if colleges and universities have the prerogative to have people of color come here and succeed, then that's something they get to do.
Right.
Can I just respond to that? I mean,
Yeah,
first of
briefly.
all, I don't know about LSATs with 10% predictions. SATs are 25%. There's nothing that better predicts first-year grades than the SAT.
But we're still talking about 75% of variance.
No, there's nothing better. That is a very high degree for anything else. In any case, I am not saying that underrepresented minorities should not go to college. Every other group, if I'm white, I'm going to go to a college where I meet the academic qualifications of my peers. So that should happen for every racial group. The only school that would actually lose diversity would probably be Harvard, because they get the cream of the crop. As you go down the tiers, the best qualified minorities have been already chosen by the top schools. The next tier goes deeper into the pool. The mismatch effect grows the next tier below that. The mismatch effect grows larger and larger, so that by the time you're in, say, the 4th or 5th level, surprisingly, it is at its most challenging. If you simply admitted students to where they were qualified, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th tier schools would be diverse. There's plenty of black students to go to a Boston college or a Boston university,
All right.
rather than catapulting them above their academic skills.
Very
I
quickly.
would struggle. Again, at
actually,
MIT,
here-
I would struggle.
Let me ask
Yeah.
well, I'll let you respond, but let me ask a question
No,
first.
just very quickly. If that were to be the case, if that were to happen, then there wouldn't be any black or brown people to work at Bain or to work at Goldman Sachs or to work at Facebook or Apple. These are the schools from which they recruit. Harvard. That is what you're proposing would systematically prevent people from having the opportunities. And I believe you have a genuine concern for Tier 3 and Tier 4 schools and their ability to recruit students. But because of poverty and how it works, I have no doubt that they'll be able to secure students in their student loan dollars for decades and generations to come.
All right, Greg, I have a question. I wanted to follow up on a point you made in your opening remarks about sort of the demographics of the country, how they're changing, and why it would almost be missing, Harvard or other elite colleges would be missing out. So Heather's repeatedly made the point that it's not the case that you wouldn't have African-American students or some kind of diverse class at Harvard. It would just be those who meet the same academic qualifications basically all around and would be in some ways race blind. Do you think that why would that change from where we are now to that world be harmful given the demographic trends?
I think you can look at the history. Look at California. Look at Texas. Look at the statistics of the admissions rates to those schools of black and Hispanic students after they outlawed affirmative action. They go down. But not only do the admissions rate goes down, the graduation rates of the black and Hispanic students that do go to those schools go down.
No.
Hey, I was, luckily I have, access to the internet, and I was just reviewing this data before we got started. The graduation rate for these schools has plummeted. The admissions rate has plummeted. There are students who discuss the fact that at UCLA right now, they have more NCAA championships than they have black male students in the freshman class. Who are non-athletes, of course. This is something that has happened before. We don't need to guess about what will be the case if affirmative action is outlawed across the country. We've seen the data does not advantage students of color.
Do you want to respond?
it is a problem that fewer blacks were qualifying without the most egregious racial preferences. And believe me, University of California has twisted itself into knots to come up with holistic admissions, and they are basically ignoring 209. But the problem we should be focused on is that, yes, at Berkeley and UCLA, the percentage of blacks and Hispanics did drop. But at the other UC schools, overall, the system within the University of California, the percentage of blacks and Hispanics did not drop. The graduation rates of students who were admitted went up because mismatch was greatly, greatly diminished. So, yes, again, it's the very top schools who are going to lose because when you get rid of the most extreme preferences. But overall, the number of students graduating from the University of California went up.
So
I wanted
like
let me ask a follow-up to Heather, and then
yeah.
we'll move to you. So you brought up a point which a few economists have tried to model, which is what schools will do, given they have this sort of fixed preference for a racially diverse class, given a legal outline of using race. And some of the predictions say that, well, what they'll end up doing is just injecting randomness into the admissions process, and you may end up with a less qualified class overall than if you had just done affirmative action the old way. Is that a concern? And do you think it's worth the risk of a legal ban of affirmative action?
Yeah, I'd rather have that than to classify people on the basis of race. And Harvard, in its lawsuit, did say, if we can't use race, we're going to have a worse outcome. That we have to what they're doing is race norming within each group. So again, Asians have to meet a very, very high standard, and then that goes down through the racial groups. So yes, they'd have more randomness, but I would frankly rather than have that than have the clear, obvious, and again, the group outcomes are not great. And if you want to try to combat any invidious stereotypes, using preferences does not help do that.
All right, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, just real quickly, the outcomes that Heather or Ms. McDonald are referring to are things like grades, things like class rank. What she's not referring to, because the data does not show that, are supreme discrepancies in job outcomes, income outcomes, the ability to have the American dream, frankly, to have a home, have a family, and support them. Yeah, I'll leave that at that.
You don't have to go to Harvard to have the American dream.
No,
There's lots of good colleges out there.
I think the solution is to completely normalize higher education across the board. That every college and university should have the exact same amount of endowment, and that should all be the same state. I mean, that's the kind of world you're leading us to, the Shangri-La, where everyone has an equal chance. When the community college and Harvard are producing the same quality of students, and people like Facebook and Google are going to, the community college and Harvard respectively to find the best students. If that's your solution, then that's your solution. But colleges can't do that on their own.
All right, this question is for both of you. It's certainly related to what we were just talking about. We'll start with Gregory and then go to Heather. In the sort of social science literature, when they study the effect of a university education on someone's life, they usually divide the theory into either a signaling theory or human capital accumulation. So signaling is you're a baked cookie by 16, and you sort of show that by performing well on standardized tests, and employers see your degree as Harvard degree, and so you do well. Human capital accumulation says there's a special sauce at Harvard, and that sort of makes you a more productive person. It seems like affirmative action really only makes sense in a world where it's human capital accumulation, and that you are truly improving every student's life by putting them through a transformative process, as we like to call here. Is that something that you would defend, and are you confident the literature supports that?
That is very interesting. To me, the transformative experience of college, particularly at a place like Harvard, is disillusionment, but that's a different story. I don't think it's either of those things, frankly. I think it's about liability. If I am trying to justify that the law firm just hired this new lawyer, if I'm trying to justify why did this startup hire this person over this person, the best thing I can say to cover my ass is, well, he got into Harvard, it can't be that bad. Harvard chose him, it can't be that bad. That is what's really about. It's about liability decreasing and being able to say, hey, don't blame us because this person screwed up the world. He went to Harvard. And that is a system in and of itself. In terms of the kind of dichotomy you set up, I think it's pretty obvious that students come to places like Harvard through social networking, through taking classes with world star professors. And in meeting students who will one day run the future world, they're going to come out with better outcomes than if they didn't get those opportunities at all.
Well, first of all, I can guarantee you that Bain will be recruiting wherever it needs to in order to get its own diverse employee force. That is, the companies are now as obsessed with racial diversity and gender diversity as colleges are. So that's not, getting rid of preferences is not going to diminish the number of blacks getting hired, I don't think. And I agree with Gregory. I wish colleges were transformative, but I think Gregory's put forward more of a signaling mechanism, frankly, that's what, by simply going to Harvard, you're signaling that you have a degree, or that you had a certain amount of credentials coming in. But I think obviously we all wish that college crammed as much knowledge into our empty noggins as possible.
All right, and this question, I think we'll do about 2 more and then go to audience questions. Or maybe we'll keep going here. We'll see how it goes.
Okay.
But
No, I want to hear it.
so one proposal you'll hear on sort of YouTube debates by people who are on the left but see a problem with the discrimination against Asian Americans is they say, well, what you really want to do is do affirmative action based on socioeconomic status, and that you just correct sort of the wrongs not of maybe racism but of capitalism, and that affirmative action is a tool to do that. Do you think that's a workable or a good idea?
Not if it involves mismatch. I don't think, again, the problem with mismatch is not race, the problem with mismatch is mismatch. So admitting somebody on the basis of a economic category into an environment where he, from the day he starts out at school, is behind his academic peers is not a good thing. And again, the gaps do not close. They continue to hinder economic success. So I wouldn't use any kind of preferences that involved bringing students in as a class that are at a significant disadvantage academically.
The only thing I'll say to your question is, first of all, there's no dichotomy. I mean, there's no kind of forced choice. You can have an affirmative action system that uses class and race, as well as things like gender, sexual orientation, religion, and other things that have been pointed out here. But secondly, the idea that a class, not race, affirmative action system is palatable relies on the kind of stereotype of African Americans and Hispanics being poor, and it's important to remember that the majority of black people are not poor, and the majority of poor people are not black, and that kind of tells you who and which groups and which group members would benefit from a class, not race-based affirmative action system.
That's I think a compelling answer, but that raises the question again. Then why, if the conditions from when LBJ's first pushing for affirmative action in government employment contracts, the conditions have changed. When he's going through, it really was the case that at least most blacks were poor, and that's no longer the case. If the historical conditions have changed, why should the policy remain constant?
That's actually not the case. The proportion of African Americans who are occupying the lower class and middle class, the working class and the middle class, has been about the same for the last century or so. It goes back to Du Bois's Philadelphia study. He found that there were more people in the top 5% of the income, more black people in the top 5% of the income rankings than there were in the bottom 10. in that city at the time. This was in the early 1900s. What we need to remember is that there were definitely, there were legacies of segregation and racism that were happening. The black middle class comprises of a lot more people than it did, but proportionally is not that different. That ultimately, the thing we have to remember is that this is part of the civil rights movement. This is part of the civil rights dream. This doesn't take anything away from it. Sorry if I got a little bit away from your question.
That's fine. So do you think, going back to you, Heather, is affirmative action, was it a just tool to use for 20 or 30 years coming out of the Jim Crow South, and its use has been used up? Was it sort of never appropriate?
If mismatch didn't exist, I would not be against it. And if it was a tiebreaker, I would not be against it. But it never is. The preferences are huge. It's 1 to 2 standard deviations in academic qualifications. It is putting a burden on its alleged beneficiaries. So if it were a question simply of as a compensatory matter, preferring blacks and putting them into situations for which they were competitive, I would not object at all. In fact, I find traditional Supreme Court jurisprudence on this question completely boring and muddled. I mean, it's incredible, like the rhetorical pretzels that the plaintiffs in this case, or any other guy, are forced to put themselves into. I mean, Kennedy has given us just incredible nonsense. It's unbelievable. I would get rid of all of it. And again, I am frankly less persuaded by the equity argument as I am by, as you say, the empirical argument that this is just not a good educational policy.
I think Heather and I definitely agree on the jurisprudence of Anthony Kennedy being mostly nonsense. And the jurisprudence when it comes to affirmative action is extraordinarily muddled. It marries the constitutionality of affirmative action and the constitutionality of race-based decision-making together in such a way that you can't divorce the two, and they really should be. One area in which the constitutional jurisprudence is clear, that has never been questioned and has always been true, is colleges and universities, since the Bakke decision put this into law, colleges and universities have a free speech right under the First Amendment to associate with and accept the students that they want to accept. Now, obviously, they can't break other laws in doing so, but the kind of ideas that colleges and universities can have a vested interest in who they bring in and who they don't bring in is something that's protected by the Constitution. But Heather, I do appreciate that your entire opposition to affirmative action is based on your kind of sympathy for people like me coming into places like this and being, swimming in deep waters without being able to paddle. But that's good.
It has
I appreciate
nothing to do with race. Again, gender, it's the exact same thing. I don't think that STEM fields should be admitting females in order to create gender equity with lower qualifications. It's simply a matter of mismatch. It has nothing to do with race.
Last question before we go to the audience. I want to hear from both of you on what you think the social ramifications of affirmative action is. Given that it's a known policy, do you think it undermines the potential success of students who are beneficiaries of affirmative action, number one? And then number two, do you think it encourages sorting? So people sort of going back in their lineage, trying to find a way to mark one box as opposed to another box to gain preference in missions. And I wonder what both of you think about the problems. Maybe we start with Heather.
Well, Mr. Davis has pointed out that, making the argument that coming from Harvard is just an enormous boost, regardless of incoming qualifications. And he is undoubtedly right about that. And Peter Arcidichiano, who was the expert witness for the plaintiffs in this case, and who did the Duke mismatch study that I referred to and I've written about, has said that it is the case in in some situations, maybe it's a sweet spot where despite mismatch, you're at a school that is going to give you such a signaling advantage that you're better off having done that. Other cases, it's not the case. So in general, though, I think it's far more harm than good. As far as sorting, the sorting that I worry about is what I hear from many faculty members, which is that different ethnic groups on campuses are also self-segregating. This may not be the case at Harvard, but at other schools it is. And I think there's many reasons for that. Part of it is we're in this environment now where we're told that the most important thing about somebody is race and ethnicity. But I think to a certain extent, mismatch may also play into that, where you have students that are seeking what is seen as safe spaces and believe that they're in an environment of microaggressions or implicit bias, whereas in fact the difficulties they may be experiencing are as a result of mismatch.
I would love to come back and have a full-fledged debate about the merits of safe spaces, but I'm sure we don't have the time for it. The concept that a person of color, particularly a black person or a Latino person, doesn't belong in certain spaces is not something that first came about with affirmative action. It wasn't that, when Johnson said, we need to take affirmative steps, or Kennedy rather, we need to take affirmative steps to encourage job. That wasn't the beginning of the, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be in that car. You shouldn't be in that suit. You shouldn't be in this building. I can tell you very clearly that when I have a fiance, grew up in California, grew up in Los Angeles, graduated post Prop 209. She was admitted to the University of California, Los Angeles, and again, in a non-affirmative action state. She had friends, white friends, Asian friends, Latino friends, who asked her, oh, you only got in because of your race, even though it's illegal. Just like Ms. McDonald pointed out before, there's this concept that there's some kind of secret devil's probation-esque affirmative action that's really, really going on. And that's why, the black people at UCLA truly, honestly don't belong there, even though there isn't any affirmative action. But the proposed solution, getting rid of affirmative action, which is bringing down the proportion of, let's say, African Americans here at Harvard, for example. If there were fewer African Americans here, how would that let go of the notion of what are you doing here? If we're 14% of the student body, if we go down to 4%, and then one of us happens to fall asleep in the Dunster Junior Common Room, someone's going to call the police because I don't even see any black people here. What are you doing here? The idea that we should get rid of race-based admissions to solve the problem of you don't belong here seems backward.
I would just say, the stigma you talk about of people assuming you're only here because of a quota, I'm sorry, that's real, and it's an inevitable result of racial preferences. And again, you cannot give an individual that may not apply for, but in a regime of racial preferences, that is a perfectly legitimate inference. And I can tell you that students, high school students, they compare their SATs. They know what's going on. It's a common trope. This person who happens to be black has a better chance of getting into Duke than students who are white or Asian. And again, I wish that weren't the case, but you cannot blame students for simply observing what is a fact of our world. And Stephen Carter at Yale Law School wrote a whole book called Reflections of Affirmative Action Baby, and what it means to be in a world where racial preferences exist.
We're going to go to the audience now. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll call on you. Please speak very clearly, both in terms of what your question actually is and with your voice. Let's start with the lady over here with the hat.
So to Gregory, when I apply for jobs, if I see a job has a women in STEM initiative,
I can't hear her.
Sorry, I'll actually repeat it.
Okay,
I can,
thanks.
So.
I'm significantly less likely to apply because I think there's something incredibly insulting about suggesting that I couldn't get the job myself or that I need predominantly male tech teams to give me a leg up. Do you not think that there's something very insulting and patronizing about university administrators suggesting, oh, we need to help you, or we need to transform you into this world leader because of your background? Do you not think that makes stereotypes so much worse?
All right, I'll just repeat it for the mic. So the question is about applying for jobs or looking at universities when they have initiatives to promote diversity that's actually very insulting and patronizing, implying that a certain group needs an extra leg up or needs to be told by a group maybe that's more prominent there how to do their job. And that was for Gregory.
Yeah. I apologize. I'm going to talk about orchestral music for a second. So orchestras started doing blind auditions. They started having a curtain between the kind of judging panel and the auditioner, so that they wouldn't be, they wouldn't have their bias against women kind of play a part of their decision making. So they did that for a while, and they looked at the data and they realized that women were still not being admitted onto orchestras at the same rate, or at parity with men. And they were like, well, I guess, the women just aren't good enough to be in, these symphony orchestras. Then they realized that these women wear heels when they auditioned. And when they would walk across the stage floor, their heels would clack, clack, clack against the wood paneling. And that was signaling to them, even without knowing what the person looked like, or if they were definitively male or female, that it was a woman. And so what they did was they laid down a red carpet so that people could walk and their footsteps would not be heard. And lo and behold, women and men were accepted to these symphony orchestras at the same proportional rate. So when you talk about something that is insulting or patronizing, I think of there's a system in which one group is here and the other group is here, and we're doing something to do this. Not to do this, but to reach back to correct the bias that's already inherently there, even if it's not explicitly stated.
But I would say that your example cuts in the opposite direction, that if you believe that there is implicit bias, you should be going to a colorblind system that does not allow implicit biases to have an effect, and just take it out of the equation. Anyway. Go.
Well, that goes back to one of the
Take the
statements
next
I made at the
question.
very beginning.
Yeah,
But,
so
yeah.
I think it was a good response, answer and
Yeah.
response. Let's go to, let's see, gentleman in the jacket here.
Hi, yeah. Ms. McDonald, this is for you. So you talked about how if we were to do away with affirmative action at colleges, we shouldn't worry about underrepresentation at Bain and McKinsey and whatever, because they're very committed to racial diversity. Do you think that's bad in itself? And if you were in charge of the world, would you prohibit them from using affirmative action too?
Well, would I prohibit them? No, I wouldn't, for the same reason that Mr. Davis spoke. I think they have a perfect right to use whatever employment criteria that they want as private institutions. I don't believe it's a good policy, however. I think, again, what we're seeing now in the STEM fields is just incredible obsession on the federal government's part and every science department, above all with gender. And we're making gender a criterion for admissions to engineering and physics departments. I think this is an incredible waste of resources. China is ruthlessly meritocratic. It doesn't give a damn if a science lab is all male or all female. I think, again, qualification should be the only thing that counts.
Quick follow-up, am I?
Yeah.
Sure, that's fine.
Where do you see this going in the future? Both of you, I guess. Do you see it sort of people, in your view, coming to their senses and getting back to a Chinese-type meritocracy, or do you see it spiraling out of control? And Greg, what do you think?
I don't see in the near future any diminution of this. And again, the problem is we cannot solve the academic skills gap at college. We have to start focusing much early on so we don't have to worry about this later on.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to the concept of affirmative action surviving the next several decades. I think the kind of unabated attack on its constitutionality has not stopped since the late 1990s when the University of Texas's program was shuttered. And I suspect that within the next decade or decades that it won't exist anymore. And that's when we have to start asking real questions about things like implicit bias on the parts of college admissions boards. The only thing I'll say to your question, though, is that college admissions has never been meritocratic. Ever. Here at Harvard, admissions started by a few men going to a few boarding schools and talking to the perfects and saying, who should we get? Who's Harvard worthy and who's Yale bound? And then they realized there were too many to do that, so they started having, essays. Then they realized there were too many Jews, so they started having interviews. All of these things none of them were ever meritocratic. That's not a system we actually live in. I don't believe a meritocratic system is actually best, but that's a whole different conversation than we've had today.
All right, we'll take one more question. Gentleman here in the gray jacket.
Thank you. Did I, Mrs. McDonald, understand you correctly in your opening remarks to say that you would prefer drawing distinctions based on voluntary rather than involuntary characteristics, but you prefer absolutely no distinctions on anything other than qualifications at all? If you had to rank a hierarchy. So if people were going to, if we can use the word discriminate without all the negative connotations, on something like, say, political belief rather than race. But if you could have your way, would you eliminate any kind of discrimination, whether it be by voluntary or involuntary characteristic?
Yeah, I would have it purely based on people's academic qualifications. I think it takes out the discretion. It takes out the nauseating self-importance of admissions committees like at Yale, at Harvard, that believe that they're crafting this thing of beauty. It's so self-important. I would just go as straightforward as possible. Because again, you're going to get diversity. The idea that simply by making sure that people are competitive with their peers, you're not going to have people that think differently, that have passions for music or art or stargazing is ridiculous. Why are we so obsessed with these superficial aspects of the self? Define people by what you love rather than by the superficialities of gonads and melanin.
All right, brief response if you want to that, and then we'll call it.
The thing I love is black people. I love helping black communities. I love being a part of black communities. I love myself as a role model to black people. That's what I wrote my college essays about. That's what I've lived my life to do. And when we talk about erasing my race, we're talking about not just which box I check on a form, but all of that as well. And I become less than human when it comes to applications.
All right, thank you to both our speakers, Mr. Davis and Ms. McDonald. Give them a round of applause. Oh, this is great. Yeah.